are taking, and even corporations are taking to battle climate change, to provide clean air and clean water for communities across the country. And one of the things that has been heartening over the past year is that across the country, there's really been an unprecedented surge of public commitments and momentum for climate action, environmental protection that's emerged among cities, among companies, among states, among other actors. In particular, since last June's announcement by the administration to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. New platforms such as We Are Still In, Climate Alliance, and others have sprouted up to help channel that interest. And as the dust is beginning to settle a year later, as we sort of survey the landscape across the country, it's really clear that perhaps, it's clear that even despite, or perhaps because of this federal abdication on climate change, we really have an unmatched opportunity to actually secure durable and decentralized solutions to some of the challenges that we've been wrestling with, even over the last 8 years. And translate this ambition, ambitious action at the state, the local levels, corporate commitments, into really measurable results while we build back that foundation for comprehensive national action. A lot of subnational actors are primed to take up the mantle. A lot of them have the nimbleness, they have the autonomy to make strong commitments, and the economic and reputational motivations to actually translate those commitments into action. So I'm excited to have joining me a real impressive set of leaders who can speak to the progress that's being made on the ground, progress that isn't garnering the headlines in the Washington Post or Denver Post or New York Times, but nonetheless, the types of tangible actions and commitments that I think are going to pull us through this time period, potentially with some more durable foundation at the local level that we can build upon. So with me today, we have Pilar Thomas. Pilar is of counsel at Lewis, Roca, Rothberger, and Christie. I might have mispronounced some of those names, where she practices in the firm's tribal lands and natural resources practice areas, as well as alternative energy and utilities practice groups, among many others. Pilar previously served as the Deputy Director for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs at USDOE, where she led efforts to promote energy development, electrification, and infrastructure improvements on tribal lands. Sitting next to her is Governor Bill Ritter. Governor Ritter founded the Center for the New Energy Economy at Colorado State University, where he currently serves as director and works with state and federal policymakers to accelerate the transition to clean energy. Previously, as Alice mentioned, he served as Colorado's 41st governor, during which time he really catapulted the state into a leadership role on climate and energy issues, working in partnership with then Majority Leader Madden, with the Associate Director of his Energy Office, Angie Fife, and other state leaders to pass over 50 pieces of clean energy legislation, creating a real durable foundation for Colorado's transition to a clean energy economy, and making a lasting impact on clean energy politics and policy across the whole Intermountain West. Next to Governor Ritter is Angie. Angie Fife is currently the Executive Director of ICLEI USA. I will leave it to Angie to provide the meaning for the acronym behind ICLEI. ICLEI is an organization that's dedicated to motivating and supporting local governments in their pursuit of deep reductions in carbon pollution. Angie's really been instrumental, particularly in the last year, in international forums, helping underscore the commitments that many municipalities have been making to drive ambitious reductions consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And she has additionally worked in past capacities as the Executive Director of Colorado's chapter of U.S. Green Building Council, and helped in the Energy Office under Governor Ritter to implement numerous pieces of clean energy legislation. So it's exciting to have Angie's expertise represented on the panel. And finally, we have Emily Fisher, who is the Vice President of Law and the Corporate Secretary for the Edison Electric Institute, the trade association of U.S. investor-owned electric utilities. Emily focuses primarily on federal and state energy and environmental regulation. It's a very small area of expertise.
I have help.
She has been a leading voice on behalf of EEI's membership on a range of hot topics: clean power plan, appropriate role of distributed generation and grid decarbonization, the DOE FERC NOPR. I'm sure she could tell you a lot about that, and maybe even demystify those acronyms, as well as a host of other things that you all have probably been hearing about lately in the news. So with that, we're going to dive quickly and right away into our discussion. There will be time for questions from the audience at the end, but also hopefully interspersed throughout the dialogue over the next hour and a half. And I'm actually going to turn to Governor Ritter to start. I'm not sure if there's really anyone who can match your both enthusiasm and confidence about what is possible, even despite federal inaction. Perhaps that's because you've actually demonstrated what can be accomplished when leaders have a real vision and actually have the courage to stand up and make that vision a reality. So I'm wondering if you could kick us off by talking a little bit about what you're seeing across the country today, areas of opportunity, how states in particular, governors, but other subnational actors are really responding to the dynamics that we've spent the morning talking about.
Thanks. Thanks, Pam. I think there are a lot of people in this room that match my enthusiasm and my ability to do what we're doing now, which is just trying to move a clean energy agenda in America. And so I do think there's some good news. I think you have to put it in the context of the bad news. And that is that Michael Bloomberg and Governor Brown put out this document called America's Pledge. And at the beginning of it, they said, if you look at what's happening at state governments, local governments with corporate purchasing, that you actually could see us meeting our climate target for the Paris target in 2026, that we can get there. But unless we have a federal partner that is engaged and willing and moving ahead, it's going to be really hard to meet the 2030 target. So there's some good news, right? That in spite of what has been a really serious rollback at the federal level of a variety of things and an outright hostility to clean power, in spite of that, there are things happening across the United States to push sort of a clean energy agenda. And David, I was glad to be here and hear your remarks. It's a lot of the things you said are just completely aligned with sort of the work that we try and do with states, with governors. But I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about what the good news is at the state level. Because as we sort of witness at the federal level, the administration's attempts to roll back, and we witness a fairly partisan Congress along, Republican and Democratic lines that are participating in that rollback, either in votes that we see on tax measures or the CRAs that were sort of that first brush with regulation that the Trump administration took on. What we're seeing at the state level differs from that. And in just the last couple of years, we've seen a variety of Republican governors in one way or another push an energy agenda that could be considered a clean energy agenda. Might not go as far as people in this room think that state should go or that governor should go. But I started this work in 2011, right when I left office, and many of those governors evolved over time into serious clean energy advocates relative to where they started. And so the governor of Nevada last year signed 9 clean energy bills. He vetoed 2, and there are a lot of people focusing on the 2 that he vetoed, but the 9 that he signed were serious pieces of clean energy legislation to try and help move Nevada along the line of a clean energy, a clean energy agenda. He was given an award by a Boulder-based group called the Western Resource Advocate, and he said, I accept this award, but I'm never going to tell anybody in Nevada that I got it. And, and he never once mentioned climate change in all of the clean energy work that he's done. But he's a card-carrying conservative. Governor Sandoval, Governor Snyder in Michigan may have done it differently than we might have thought he could have or should have. But when I started, Michigan had 60% of all of its load was from imported coal. At 11 cents a kilowatt hour was the levelized cost of energy. And the governor has since passed a clean energy agenda. It's going to be a mix, and gas is going to be included in that. But there's also solar and wind that are going to be a part of that. And the 2 CEOs of the 2 biggest utilities are on board to try and push that agenda as well. And I just heard one of them speak in Denver at the Climate Leadership Conference, Jerry Anderson. He's got a way of talking about this that is about reducing carbon by 80% by 2050. No CEO in America of a utility, pardon me, but I think not many of them were talking about 80% reductions along the lines of 2050 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And so this is this thing that's kind of evolved. And so without going state by state, but the governors of Nevada, Illinois, even Ohio, who vetoed a bill, Michigan, Massachusetts, Maryland, Vermont, New Hampshire. They're all Republicans. And they are all part of a governor's clean energy accord where they're trying to push this. And I mentioned the Republicans just to show you that there is something, I think, happening in this country where Republican governors, while they're many of them sort of at the end of their tenure, some of them in the middle of their tenure, have taken a different ownership role around trying to advance a clean energy agenda. And even Matt Mead to our north, a climate denier when he started, a person who's supporting coal, because in 2016 or 2015, all three of his biggest coal companies were in bankruptcy. He began talking to environmental groups about pursuing a clean energy agenda. It doesn't help that they tax wind in Wyoming, but one of the lessons to him was you got to think about incentivizing this, not punishing this, Governor. But he spoke to a variety of groups, including the Environmental Defense Fund and a group that I chair, the Energy Foundation out of San Francisco. He spoke with participants from there saying, listen, I really do want to build a clean energy agenda. This is a pretty serious conservative from the largest coal producing state in America who's looking at it saying there is a transition that's necessary. So our work with these states is to try and understand what that transition is. And I'm going to finish this set of my remarks by just focusing on the West. So we've done a series of analytics. We were the convener for 13 Western states on the Clean Power Plan. We were trying to help those states understand the regional challenges of the transitions that would come with the Clean Power Plan. Each of those states had their own processes, but my center had 13 states. And then the Clean Power Plan sort of went away. I once said in a speech that, because the Supreme Court stayed the Clean Power Plan on February the 9th, and Scalia died on the 13th. And I said, Scalia just didn't die soon enough. And they say, why don't you say that they decided the Clean Power Plan early? And so be more gentle. And so now I say, I wish they would have decided it a week later, is what I say, because it wouldn't have been stayed. But once it was stayed, that work stopped. The Western state work didn't stop because the governors still understand we are in this transition. So we looked, and if you look at just the resource plans, 10 years from now, 45% of all the coal in the West, coal-fired generation, is gone by resource planning. And then we looked at what's left after that, and if you look at what's left after that, most of the plants are over 50 years old, or the scrubbers are going to have to be replaced in that next decade, and they're going to be very expensive, especially if you compare them to the downward curve in renewables, to combined cycle natural gas, and we believe it's very likely they will not keep running coal in that next decade. And so, and we presented this to the utilities in the West. They didn't disagree with us. 90% of the coal in the West will be gone in 20 years. And you're not going to resuscitate that, no matter who you are. You're not going to make that come back. And just today, there was another story about Colstrip and the last 2 units. Colstrip in Montana, the biggest power plant in Montana, had 4 units, 2 already planned for retirement. The next 2 are planned in 2027. That wasn't even in our 45% calculation. So this transition's happening. What replaces it is the open question, and I think that's fodder for our discussion today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Governor. I'm going to turn, Angie, to you next, drilling down a bit below the state level. What's happening with cities? There's nearly 250 cities and counties, along with 2,000 plus businesses from every state in the nation who've committed to pursuing reductions that are consistent with the international climate goals. Can you tell us a little bit more about that action at the municipal level, what's working, and what you see on the horizon for the next few years?
Absolutely. Happy to, Pam. Thank you very much. I thought you liked me, but now I don't think so because you made me follow the governor. So it indeed is a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Alice, for inviting me. ICLEI is a network of local governments across the United States. I am the executive director for the U.S. office. We have one of our board members here, Matt Applebaum. But we are also a global organization, and so we get involved in the COPs, the Conference of the Parties. ICLEI has a unique role at the UNFCCC. We represent the local government and municipal authorities working group at the UNFCCC. So we always take a group of elected officials to the COPs. So thinking back to Paris, COP21 in December of 2015, as you know, each country brought forward its intended nationally determined contribution. The NDC for the United States, of course, was to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 26% from 2005 to 2025 by that 26%. And most of that came from Clean Power Plan, CAFE standards, federal action in buildings, cleaning up the federal fleet, and that sort of thing. So why the focus on cities? There was nothing in the NDC that was specific to cities. Well, if we just draw a boundary around cities and we count the greenhouse gas emissions that occur within those cities, 70% of global emissions occur in cities, while cities only take up 2% of the landmass across the globe. So naturally, some focus on cities. But we have to ask ourselves, are we counting the right things, and are we counting them in the right ways? We use an accounting protocol. There's a couple of them. ICLEI has, over the years, developed these protocols. The first one is called the U.S. Community Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions. And so, again, it's looking at what occurs within that boundary. There's also now a global protocol where Boulder can conduct an emissions inventory, and then they can look at emissions that occur outside of the United States. They can look at their neighbors, Toronto, Copenhagen, and see how they compare. But still, these accounting methodologies do not include things like production and consumption. So there's recently been some analysis on if we were to expand a city's greenhouse gas emissions accounting framework to include consumption, that some of the mega cities, for example, would have a 60% increase in their greenhouse gas emissions based on food, clothing, electronics, and things like that that are produced outside of their community and pulled into the community through consumption. But at ICLEI, we've been trying to focus on what cities have control over. And so we have a software tool called ClearPath. ClearPath allows a city to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, create a climate action plan. And because that's cloud-based, now we can see all of these emissions inventories. We have 383 jurisdictions across the US that have inventories in the software. They have 953 inventories in the software. So obviously, each jurisdiction has more than one inventory within the software. And we can see that the progress that cities are making is attributable in large part to state policies. So renewable portfolio standards are really moving the dial for cities. And so recently, we've worked with the US Department of Energy and a number of communities to do a contribution analysis, looking at the drivers of change between two emissions inventories. So we're now able to take, say, Boulder's emissions inventory for 2015, compare it to 2010, and say what was driving the change in those emissions over that time. And see where the policies that are implemented at the local level are moving the dial versus what's happening at the state. Or maybe it's just that it was a warmer winter and we didn't use heating as much, or it was a cooler summer and we didn't have to use cooling as much. So we're getting into that analysis to understand cities more clearly and to help them to make better decisions. From a movement perspective, the WASI, the We Are Still In movement, this really did come about in June, right after President Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And it was a movement of the businesses, universities, local governments, state governments. And the America's Pledge then is, well, the WASI part is the movement part. The America's Pledge is the analysis and what's it going to take to get the United States to meet its nationally determined contribution. So we're working with the Rocky Mountain Institute and WRI and a number of other organizations on helping to quantify what are the high impact areas that those four sets of actors could embark on. There will be a global climate summit in September in San Francisco that Jerry Brown is convening, and this America's Pledge high impact analysis will come forward there. I think for us at the city level, what we're really seeing in terms of tearing down these political fences is the recognition of cities that they have to start taking action around climate preparedness and building resilient cities. I was in Miami not too long ago, met with some of the community leaders there. They cannot get a solar program off the ground in Miami. you would think that Miami might be a place where there would be plenty of solar. No local solar program, but they can talk about resilience and climate change all day long as it's framed in what are we going to do about the fact that Miami Beach's streets are flooding on a regular basis when the sun's out and it's not raining. So it's interesting to see how we 5-10 years ago would use energy efficiency as a door opener to renewable energy, and getting folks to start talking about that. I think we're seeing more of the adaptation, the need for adaptation and resilience planning, and of course the mitigation and the adaptation have to go hand in hand and work together, and it's really helping it, I think, to open some doors to that conversation.
Great. So we're going to jump to the end of the table with Pilar. You've been working with tribal communities on energy and environmental challenges for decades. And I'm hoping you could tell us a bit about the partnerships that are necessary in that work, particularly with states and cities, hearing both from Bill and Angie about the momentum that's happening in both of those contexts. And tell us a little bit about what you're seeing across tribal communities in the country as they're thinking about resilience issues as well as potentially mitigation.
So as I once said to Secretary Moniz, enough about the states and cities. Let's talk about the people who were here before everybody else was. So thank you. I have done quite a bit of work both at Energy, Interior, in my practice now for my own tribe around climate change issues, climate change related issues. Obviously out of the Obama administration, a big push, especially through the state, local, and tribal leader task force that was stood up by the president around his climate action plan and supporting the tribal leaders and tribal voices and the federal government's response to this. You know, the challenge that tribes have, first and foremost, is even though there's 573 of them now, six new ones out of Virginia, just recognized by federal law, by Congress last month. We don't have much of an impact, obviously, from creating the problem, because we're not a very large population. We don't have a lot of industry. Outside of Navajo, who's got 2 coal-fired power plants, and a couple of other tribes that have pretty big EGUs. Indian country is just not contributing to the problem. But we are, for the most part, at the tip of the spear when it comes to feeling the direct impacts of the problem. Probably most acutely felt first in the Northwest and in Alaska. So the Northwest tends to feel the climate impacts in the natural environment. And for them, that's because they still have a great deal of connection to their natural resources for subsistence purposes, for cultural purposes, probably more so than just about any other kind of region of tribes in the lower 48. And then in Alaska, both subsistence, a high economy, of subsistence economy, but the villages, I think by Army Corps' count 10 years ago, up to 45 villages on the coast and on the rivers who probably needed to be relocated because of climate change impacts in the Arctic, huge flooding issues, less sea ice issues. And so they're feeling it not just from a natural environment perspective, but they are all feeling it up there from a built environment perspective. And so one of the things that most tribes do is when they're doing climate action planning, for example, climate adaptation planning, funded originally by Interior. They've changed the name of that program from climate resiliency to resiliency. I don't think the word climate is to be found in any federal government communication anymore, or on a website or in a book or anything, other than maybe when it snows and then they go, look, there's no climate change because it's snowing today in DC. But in any event, I digress. So when tribes do climate action planning and climate adaptation planning, they focus less on mitigation because, again, they're not really contributing, although they try and do their part, right? So to the extent they can do clean energy, distributed energy, they look for those opportunities. But for them, it's really more about protecting the community and reacting And because it is mostly around the natural resource world, the natural environment, that's where most of their focus is. There's probably about 25 to 30 tribes that have done pretty comprehensive climate adaptation plans, most of them in the Northwest, a handful in Arizona, and across the country, but most of them in the Northwest. And the plans that stand out from the tribe's perspective are those where they've worked with their local communities to develop an integrated plan. Because no tribe is an island, as much as some tribes like to think they are, and in general Indian country we like to think it is. We're not islands. So we are most successful when we work with really the local community, trying to partner with them on whether it's adaptation strategies, whether it's energy resiliency strategies. Tribes do less with their state governments for a lot of different reasons, and even tribes in kind of good states where there's a good working relationship. They still tend to do less at the state level and more at the local community level. So there's a lot of opportunity for tribes working not just in their own community on the kind of adaptation resiliency planning they can be doing for their community's protection. I would like to see them focus a little bit more on the built environment, a little bit less on the fish and the trees, a little bit more on the houses and the energy systems. And I think that as we see, we've seen the cost curve come down on utility scale solar. We have yet to see that kind of cost decline on distributed solar, for example, and distributed energy technologies. I would posit that the reason why you see in some Republican states an interest in clean energy is because distributed energy will have a profound impact on the utility model. And those utilities run scarce, right? Arizona just got rid of its net metering. So all the tribes in Arizona now have literally no opportunity to do net metering anymore. So that some states are Nevada got rid of net metering until the legislature passed a law to put it back in. So utilities in some states are still exerting quite a bit of control, and the tribes have to navigate that system. And so their planning has to compensate not just for kind of this utility behemoth that in certain states, Arizona, APS, pretty much controls our regulatory process there, versus other states where you might have, California wants to see solar on everybody's rooftop, right? So this diversity in state approach creates a challenge for tribes as well. So tribes within a state have got to think about what the state's doing. They've got to look at what their local community is doing. Maybe they band together with the local community to get the state to do something else, or they band with everybody to go against the utility. But we've got to really identify where our real pinch points are. And so if as tribes we look a little bit more at the built environment and how we can adapt and be more resilient in the built environment, that's kind of the second half of this climate adaptation planning. And you can't do that without working with the state and local governments. Infrastructure is multi-jurisdictional, so you have no choice but to work with everybody if you're going to try and create at least a region-wide effort that protects everybody. I'll just end that in some places, the tribe's casino, its hotel, maybe its infrastructure is probably the critical infrastructure of the area. So I'm reminded of in Southern California, outside of San Diego, 2005 or so, there was this massive wildfire, burned half the county down. And there's a tribe, the Rincon Band of Los Sueños Indians is in a valley. They've got this big casino, and everybody in that area ran to the casino. Why? Because that's where all the fire trucks were. Because if there was one thing that was going to be saved, it was the casino. And literally, when you drove out there, across the street, the fire had burned all the way across the street. And the tribe had all its fire trucks surrounding that casino, so the whole area, Indian and non-Indian alike, ran to the casino because they knew that was what was going to be saved. So we had a similar story out of Oklahoma. when they had these massive tornadoes, and everybody ran to the casino because the casino was tornado hardened. So tribal infrastructure can be critical infrastructure in certain rural areas, and so tribes working with their local communities and hardening their own infrastructure is one way to see a little bit more success in this adaptation effort.
Great, thank you. Moving to Emily, as we've heard, there's sort of a host of things underway, right? States are evaluating policies, municipalities are committing to climate targets and thinking about procurement. There's partnerships that are necessary and increasingly necessary with tribal communities on infrastructure as well as both mitigation and adaptation. But at the same time, there are many actions being undertaken by corporations in response to both market trends, and we heard a lot about that on the lunchtime panel, and with an eye towards mitigating both regulatory risk as well as climate risk itself. Many of these significant actions are actually being undertaken in the electric power sector. Can you talk a little bit about how your membership is responding both to non-federal policies and preferences as well as these overarching market trends that we're hearing a lot about today?
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you for the invitation to participate, and thank you to my other panelists. I was kind of afraid that I was surplus to requirements after I heard Professor Spence speak, and then I heard the governor speak, and I'm definitely sure that I'm not entirely sure I'm doing here. But I'll tell you some stories anyway, and see what you think of them. There are a lot of drivers for why utilities do things. They're companies, they make money, but we also have something called the Regulatory Compact. It's something that developed as we electrified America, and if you're going to put aside co-ops and municipal utilities for a second, but we got a franchise service territory and a regulated rate of return in exchange for the obligation to serve everybody, and that means everybody. And that exists even in states that no longer use cost of service and have direct state regulation of all three parts of generation, transmission, and distribution. That also still exists in restructured states where you can pick your own electricity provider. The old utility still has to be the provider of last resort. So we take the triangle that Professor Spence put forward really seriously. It has to be affordable, reliable, and increasingly clean. But affordable is pretty darn important, and it drives a lot of the state decisions. And in fact, in a lot of states, least cost planning is the requirement. So it wasn't an ideological love of coal that made anyone use coal in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. It was that it was really cheap. And giving people cheap power is important because if you've ever received an unexpectedly high electric bill, you know that that's not a happy experience. And energy prices are incredibly regressive, and they can hurt some of the poorest among us the most. I live in a tiny row house on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. My bill's the same pretty much year-round. It's about $100. That's not an impact on my family's budget. It really can be on other people's, and we have an obligation to serve all of those people and to think really hard about affordable. So we have seen a huge shift in the generation fleet nationwide, and there are particular changes that are even more massive in particular regions. But in 2006, we got more than 50% of our electricity as a nation from coal. We got about a quarter from gas. We got about 20% from nuclear, and then there was a little bit left over for renewables, and most of that was hydro. Flip forward to 2016, the change is pretty significant. We got almost a third of our electricity from gas, a third from coal, and a third from non-emitting resources. That does include nuclear, but it's about 9% nationally on renewables. And if you look at, I think Professor Spence showed us, California gets almost 25%. Places you wouldn't expect, like Montana, get like 19%. Iowa gets like a huge portion of its electricity from wind, kind of like Texas. They are blessed with an incredible wind resource, and they are using state policies to harness that and to encourage the utility to build wind and to use it as a way to actually attract investment in states. And so one is all of these things have become so much cheaper. And when they become cheaper, they become things that we can deploy. And then because we pass those costs on to customers, we can do that without increasing costs for everyone. And you'll notice that even though it might feel like your electricity bill goes up all the time, they're actually declining in real terms. And they have been for more than a decade. So we've been able to integrate more renewables, and we'll be able to continue to integrate more renewables into our system really affordably going forward. Actually, the panels that you use for distributed solar on rooftops, they're the exact same panels. Most of the costs associated with distributed resources actually have to do with installation and customer acquisition. So those are other kind of costs. I don't know.
Soft costs.
The soft costs, you got to get at those, but it's expensive to put that stuff on everyone's house. We'll save our fight for about net metering for later, okay? Anyway, one is cost. Another big, huge driver is customer demand. Both retail customers and big customers, I think also Professor Spence had a chart of customers in the Southeast, which you don't necessarily associate with people who might have the hugest interest in environmental issues. Huge customers, Amazon, Walmart, all of the big box stores, all of the big online retailers come to my members and say, you better figure out how to get me 100% renewables or I'm going somewhere else, and they're serious. And so we have seen huge movement by my members to help those guys figure out how to put together packages of renewables that satisfy their reliability requirements, so they are backed up with other resources, and also satisfy their cost requirements. And it is a competitive world out there, and those guys will take their business somewhere else if you don't act on it. Another huge driver of this big shift in our portfolio has to do with the investment community. The investment community is loud about how they feel about climate, and they will happily engage in like shareholder derivative suits if they don't see you making progress toward the goal. About a quarter of the shares of my member companies, so all the investor-owned utilities, are held by European investors, and they have no qualms about saying they're not interested in investing in coal or even natural gas anymore. I think the natural gas piece is going to be challenging going forward. We do need it for reliability. We might not need it as much of it for reliability as we once thought, but it's not something we can do away with right now and continue to maintain the levels of reliability that people demand. And so those are a huge number of drivers. Also, state actions that pre-exist before sort of this dearth of federal leadership. State RPSs really drove deployment of renewables before their costs came down, so that they were more in line with the kind of cost we see for other resources. So I was going to talk about all of the climate commitments that my members have made voluntarily over the course of the last year. I'll say that we had this incredibly progressive climate conversation the weekend before the 2016 elections. It was a really exciting conversation. We were talking about all this cool stuff we were going to do, and then like that was literally Sunday. I flew home Tuesday morning, and then I was like, oh no, what are we gonna do? Are these people gonna, like I was a little bit worried briefly. I was like, oh, that was so good. Are they gonna be bad? And they weren't, and they're not. Because customers want it, because it's affordable, because investors are pushing on it. And they looked around and they said, it doesn't make any sense for us to not continue down the clean energy path. I'm not gonna say that regulatory drivers aren't important. They definitely play a role, but a huge number of my members, I have about 60 large members, about 15 of them so far in the last year, and I'm expecting about another 15 more, have made voluntary climate pledges about reducing their emissions 60, 70, 80%, if not more, 2030, 2040, 2050. So you heard Jerry Anderson, who is a convert. That is not always how he used to talk. He's amazing. He's like, this is what my customers want. This makes sense. This is what I'm going to do. It also makes sense for his company. Making pledges of 80% reductions by 2040, and then I think the other company in Michigan, CMS, decided to one-up him recently. So now I'm going to see what happens with that. But they are all making these kinds of long-term pledges because that's where they're going. And so it's interesting to be part of an industry that's in so much of a transition and so much is changing. But they feel like they have a real big role in making progress. And the other thing they're really excited about is electric vehicles, because it's easier to decarbonize the power sector than it is to decarbonize transportation. It turns out power plants don't move, and that there are good substitutes for those. So far, we haven't figured out really good substitutes for personal mobility. My husband loves the bus, but he's literally the only person I know who goes out of his, we bought our house because it was on a bus line. He's the only person that walks around looking at bus lines, I'm fairly certain. And of course, we live in an area that has good public transportation too, which is hugely important. But because it's going to be a lot harder to deal with transportation, using decarbonized electricity to decarbonize the transportation sector is huge. Electricity generation was the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the United States up until 2016, and then we were surpassed by transportation, and they beat us again in 2017. That trend isn't going to change. So we have an obligation to work on transportation too, and this is a really good way of doing it. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at and talking about.
Exciting. So I'm going to stick with the power sector. I know that we've had a lot of power sector discussion today, but there's a lot of expertise on this panel. So I'm going to stay on this train of thought for a few minutes. I'm wondering, teeing off of the conversation about corporate corporate procurement requests of your membership. That's obviously driving some decisions that your companies are making. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about similar drivers that you're feeling from municipal customers, and if, Angie, you could speak to that as well. There's obviously cities that are starting to use their leverage, potentially in franchise negotiations, potentially in other forums, to push their power suppliers, recognizing that that's a big part of their ability to achieve their greenhouse gas targets. I'm wondering if you two could address that and talk about what's happening, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities?
Yeah, what's interesting to me about this 100% renewable energy cities movement that we heard a little bit about earlier is that it's the first time recently that I've started to hear staff people within the mayor's office say, my mayor wants to do 100% renewable energy. They committed us to this, and we're not sure how to get there. It's always been driven by the staff, generally, like the elected officials. So I think that's an interesting turn of events. Part of it, I think, actually comes from people like Mark Jacobson, who's been widely criticized for his work on, daring us to think about a 100% renewable energy scenario. There were apparently a number of problems with his modeling based on feedback from other reviewers. But the one thing that it did do is it set out this sort of audacious target that people kind of got their arms around because it's easy to communicate. 100% renewable energy sort of makes sense to people. So I think that's certainly a direction that cities will continue to go. We're seeing more and more cities look at their own municipal operations, their own buildings as a first step to do that. Can I ask a question of one of the panelists?
Sure.
Thank you, Pam. Well, I'm really interested in this cost conversation and externalities. Now, I understand that if we were to look at the externalities associated with climate change and pass that on to customers, that would mean increased utility bills, right, for customers, most likely. But I was at an event recently where the reinsurance industry, Swiss Re and Munich
Beware
Re,
the insurance industry.
Okay, there we go.
We just want to
All
be
right,
off of
so they
this.
were saying that in the Harvey event that happened in Houston recently, that the folks who were underinsured or uninsured were 80% of those who were affected, where only 20% were insured or insured to the extent that they need to be insured. And so that those losses will be shared by all of us, right? If we have health impacts, asthma attacks, and that sort of thing, those health impacts are potentially a shared cost. So I'm wondering, is there an appetite, do you think, in the regulatory industry to say, okay, we're paying over here, so let's stop paying over here and let's start paying over here? Is that possible?
It's a really interesting idea because essentially that's what electricity rates are, is their socialization of costs. Because if I looked at how much it costs to serve every individual person, the cost would vary per household. And some people's costs would be higher than others because you need more infrastructure, or, for whatever reason. So we decided as a policy thing that it was more fair to sort of take all and that's what cost of service rate making is you figure out what is the cost of serving everyone, and then you kind of charge everyone the same thing, and then the only real variant is your usage, because that's something you have control over. We could have a whole conversation about whether or not that actually makes sense now, but we won't. But that is essentially, that's a longer conversation, but that's essentially what we do now with electricity rates. And so this is a really interesting question that you posed, because the state of California did something with its common law back in 1999 with respect to wildfires. Wildfires risks are way up in California. It's a climate change impact. I'm sure everyone saw the news about the horrific fires in Northern California, and there were fires in Southern California too. But under case law in California, the way that it works is they use the state's inverse condemnation provision in their constitution and say that because the public utilities have condemnation rights for transmission lines and for distribution facilities in California, this was back in 1999, they would treat them as public entities and say that anytime there was a fire, and often when there's fire in California, it either is started by or made worse by power lines, because once the winds start to blow, they blow the lines off of the poles touch vegetation, it gets worse. There's pretty much no way that one of the 40 fires raging in Northern California in the fall wasn't at least at some level caused by some sort of power line vegetation impact. So because that's the case, and because they have this inverse condemnation thing, and they've decided to pretend just for this one little bit that these are public entities, they are actually liable for all of the damages for the fires, strictly liable. It's billions of dollars worth of damages. We don't know yet because the cases haven't run through the California courts, but it's entirely possible that at least my member company in Northern California has already suspended their dividend, and they're thinking about long-term whether or not they're going to be solvent. Certainly the financial community doesn't want to lend them any money because it could be billions of dollars worth of damages. But so why did they do this in the case law? Because they said, well, you can just re-socialize all the costs through power, for the electricity rates. And so they were doing that in California up until this year, but then the California Public Utility Commission said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. So I think you can only socialize the cost if you agree that everyone's going to socialize the cost. So that system has sort of fallen apart in California. It's the exact same problem. We see an increased risk. People get harmed, not through any fault of their own. You don't know where the fire is going to strike. You don't know where the flood is going to hit. But everyone pays electricity rates. We should all help each other out. Let's socialize this as a social insurance program. There's a social insurance program, a federal fund for flooding that does address some of that. But in California, they came up with this alternate regime, and it's not going to work. It's going to break. And I think one of the biggest concerns we have is that, I don't think the state of California fully grasps that the largest tools of public policy they've ever had are the 3 investor-owned utilities, because they set audacious environmental goals and those companies meet them, and they meet them because they can raise capital and make the investments. And if they still have audacious goals in California about getting to further reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, further renewables deployment, and if one of those companies goes bankrupt, I think it will seriously imperil their ability to do that in an affordable way. So if you're going to have a conversation about socialization of costs, you have to make sure that they're really going to be socialized, and you have to think about what those costs are going to be. And the social cost of carbon, which has been disavowed by the administration, was what, like 35, 36 bucks?
42.
42, depending, yeah, I never remember the discount rate that they're using. You could put that in wholesale power prices, and it probably wouldn't be terrible. In terms of increasing prices. It would increase prices, but it probably would be manageable for a large amount of people. But whether or not FERC can do that, whether or not the states want to do that, there's a lot of political will behind all of those decisions.
Yeah, so I would take the conversation back just a step and say the efforts that have been to socialize costs that are externalities that have been successful have been about the air, sulfur dioxide, so having a cap and trade system for SO2 was a successful cap and trade system. The EPA had to, I'm pointing, but for our former EPA, sorry, Sean left, so I pointed to you. But the EPA had to work on NOx, and that's an externality, and mercury is an externality, and ozone and haze, and those are all part of us socializing costs with an externality. But we got to carbon, and we got shut down. The EPA got shut down through the stay of the courts, and then the Trump administration seems to be on hold. And we were working with utilities in the West on the Clean Power Plan, some of whom I think understood the importance of trying to do this, because it really is a market effect. You are capturing an externality. So California, in their cap and trade system, it's economy-wide. It's not just about the power sector, but they've now been joined by Quebec, Ontario, and BC is considering joining them. Their last auction was a $1.5 billion auction on their cap and trade system for selling sort of carbon credits, and that's working.
Yeah.
Like, that is having an influence that is important in California in terms of economy-wide carbon, and also seems to be able to hold carbon producers in check or have them seeking for alternatives, because they don't want to go to the market on this, because the market has now become really big. And so we're not going to see this state by state. Our work with states tells us, and David alluded to the fact that the state of Washington had, they have a climate hawk for a governor, who in his now 6th year of being governor, I think, is really frustrated that he cannot get done the kinds of things that he came into office to do. And now he's got majorities, Democrats, in the House and the Senate. I think he thought he was going to get it done. And this pricing of carbon in the state of Washington is now stalled completely, because it's hard to do in the state, because it winds up being something that pits businesses against sometimes each other, but certainly business community, sometimes against the environmental community, but the stakeholders all go into their corners and they come out boxing. If you do it at the federal level, if you had some way of doing it at the federal level, states would fall in line, and I think we'd see something like we've seen in California, which is an appropriate capturing of an externality through a market mechanism. And that's what we should do.
Can I add that in addition to worrying about kind of how you actually pay for that externality, which is the challenge, right? So today, my tribe gets 100% of their power through their co-op, which is 100% coal. That coal-fired power plant is paying nothing for those externalities, not paying it in the price. You know, the members of the co-op aren't paying a higher price to pay for those externalities. So California creates a different model, not just because they're capping the carbon that's being emitted. People have to buy allowances to do that. But they require that 25% of the funds raised go to vulnerable communities for climate adaptation. So it's not even just about paying for your externality, it's then redistributing that to the most vulnerable communities who will be vulnerable no matter what, right? Unless you shut it all down, and they're still going to be vulnerable because they're still dealing with the consequences of it. So I think there's a second aspect to that question. That cost question is, even if you paid your cost, where should the benefit of that payment go? And California says, well, 25% of that benefit goes to the vulnerable communities, where we're planting trees and we're dealing with climate adaptation in these vulnerable communities, doing rooftop solar, doing distributed energy, putting storage in. So I think there's an aspect of that. I mean, this is the challenge the tribes have, is they're victims, and so who's going to help pay for their adaptation? And so the more you can get people to join together to reduce costs in doing stuff, or at a state level or at a federal level, and I think even at a regional level, I don't know why a county can't create some type of incentive program, and whether it's a city that's 100% through their franchise, or tribes through their pure regulatory authority as a sovereign to say to the utility, you got to do this. But I do think that there's still this other component that is important, which is how do we then pay for the vulnerable communities, the low-income communities, the people who are really feeling the brunt, cannot afford to adapt their way out of it. Even as resilient as we are, we just can't afford to do it. So I think that's also got to be part of the question.
It's really about program design, right? Like, the reason why industries get grumpy about it is they always see that someone else is going to have a competitive advantage, right? So if you regulate just some of them and not others of them, if you create a market, people will seek their ways to make money in the market. So a federal program was something that actually we supported way back when they had Waxman-Markey, which was it actually passed the House in 2010. It was a proposed federal cap and trade regime, and we supported it because it would apply. It was going to phase in, but it was going to be economy-wide, and all of my members would be in. Everyone would understand what the rules of the road were. The cap would decline over time. People could make planning decisions. And just like you said, money was reserved through the sale of the credits. A whole bunch of that money had to go back to the customers because people knew that it meant that electricity prices were going to go up. So a whole bunch of that money just had to go directly and be refunded back to the customers. A pool of money was created actually for R&D so that we could work on climate technologies. And then a pool was going to be reserved to help the most vulnerable populations. There are ways to do that. You just have to all agree that that's what we're doing.
Right.
So I want to build on that and build on, Pilar, something you said, which is there should be no reason why communities or counties couldn't come together and do X, Y, or Z, and talk a little bit more specifically about states and what might exist in terms of states' executive authority. One example of a state that is moving ahead with a carbon pricing program to effectuate a cap and trade program to price this externality and find ways to use those revenues in productive ways for the most vulnerable in that state is Virginia. It's a state that did a tremendous amount of work under the auspices of the Clean Power Plan, thinking about the opportunities to reduce carbon pollution from the electric power sector, and has decided, even in the absence of federal regulatory overlay or federal regulatory requirement, to continue to move forward, develop a program under state authority, and look to collaborate regionally, looking to the northeastern states, and create flexible, low-cost compliance strategies for their affected utilities. So one question I have for the panelists, and I'm going to point to Bill first, is how do we actually translate what the realm of the possible is in terms of executive authority at the state level. Same applies at the city level and with other actors, into that kind of action where people are willing to actually use the levers, the policy levers that they have now, instead of kind of keeping the brakes on some of these transformative policy ideas.
Well, I think it's important to note that the organic authority for governors is different across the country. The governor of Texas arguably is weaker than the lieutenant governor of Texas because of the different things the lieutenant governor controls. So there's partly that. The second thing is, in the instance of Virginia, you have a brand new governor who is coming in term limited. They serve one term and they're out, and so he doesn't have a lot to lose, and it's untested yet about whether or not he can actually get there. It's a pretty favorable political environment, and this is where politics matter. I mean, politics and policy are never, sleeping in separate bedrooms. I mean, they are together all the time, and in this case, you had a bunch of legislators in Virginia who made it very clear they were no longer going to take money from Dominion, which is a very powerful power company, and in many respects has owned the state legislature for a very long time, or at least the perception was that they did. So Virginia's he's ideally situated here. I think if you take a place like Colorado right now, the governor's got a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, and if he were to entertain that same executive order right now, the Senate would be up in arms. It'd be a political wedge issue in a election year, 2018, where I think the Democrats very much hope that they can take the Senate, but where the Republicans could make very good use of this executive order and say it was overreaching. So my center wrote a document for Barack Obama, and we really made 200 recommendations at their request about how to move a clean energy agenda in his last term. But that became the Obama overreach, and it was very effective in many respects, watching Donald Trump and other Republicans talk about regulatory overreach and just making it sort of the proxy for all else wrong with government. And so I do think governors have to be very careful about what they do by executive order, particularly if the politics around it are mixed, and they could find, A, that they're not supported, and worse, that it becomes this wedge issue and they struggle in an election year. So, I mean, that's my sense about this. I still think that there are places where there are probably governors that are willing to do that. Kate Brown in Oregon is very interested in trying to move some kind of a partnership with California on cap and trade. She didn't get it done, but they had a very short session, and so I think she's still willing. Inslee, I think, will probably do something by executive order when he's in his last couple of years. He's not term limited, and he may run again for a third term. If he does run again for a third term, he's not likely to do an executive order until he's in his third term. And so the politics of this matter a lot. In New Mexico, I think there's a very good chance you're going to have Democratic control of the House and the Senate plus a Democratic governor. And I think the whole world will shift in New Mexico next year if that's true, because you've had a very conservative governor who's held things up. And so it's really important to try and understand both the politics and the policy in order to understand why a governor would or would not be able to do an executive order.
Pilar, do you see any opportunities where there's a pathway for tribal leadership to take a stand, take an action, identify a requirement that could meaningfully change either the sort of progress towards resiliency or the opportunity to participate in mitigation activities, and that's sort of within their authority that you've
So
identified?
there's probably 3 or 4 major things that some tribes are doing, some tribes are looking at doing, some tribes don't even care about climate change because it's always hot in Arizona. So it's like, what's another degree or two at this point? But there's a group of tribes that have actually, again, out of the Northwest, affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, who passed a resolution. The National Indian Gaming Association passed a resolution to support the We're Still In campaign, encouraging their members to join. There's a handful of tribes out of California and out of Washington that have joined the We're Still In campaign. So those folks have always, though, been kind of at the leading edge of climate change action, climate action. A couple of other things that tribes could do as tribes. One is they could exercise their sovereign authority over their own lands to require the utilities, at least that service them, out of the I'll take the 229 out of Alaska out of the equation. So out of the 300 plus tribes in the lower 48, maybe 10 have their own utilities. So everybody else is on somebody else's utility system. So much like the cities can leverage franchise agreements to say to their utility, we want 100% renewable, or you're going to do something a little bit cleaner, tribes can exercise a comparable sovereign authority over utilities on their lands. And I think if they did that, they get around kind of the state regulatory mechanism that would keep that would not encourage a utility to support distributed energy by the tribe saying, you're going to put up as much we're going to be able to put as much rooftop solar as we want on our tribal housing, on our tribal lands, and you utility, well, you're just going to have to take it, because or we'll go find another utility, right? So they can exercise their sovereign authority to do that. I think that would promote more distributed energy on tribal lands, which by definition is an adaptation and a resiliency mechanism for tribes in dealing with climate action. There are a handful of tribes that have enough land and enough resources that they actually could support corporate procurement responsibilities. So Gila River outside of Phoenix, it borders, the reservation borders Intel. Intel has now got a 100% renewable requirement. So Intel could just as easily say to Gila River, right across the street, put a 250 megawatt power plant right here and we'll buy all the power for this massive Intel plant that's there. So there's lots of those kind of partnering opportunities for tribes that have resources that are close enough to the load, if you're in an urban environment or relatively urban, or close enough to a couple of substations to get it to a load. It's unfortunate that there's only 2 commercial scale renewable energy projects in Indian country, one outside of San Diego, which is a 50 megawatt wind farm, and the other, the Moapa Band of Paiutes in Nevada, outside of Las Vegas. It's 250 megawatt solar, and that power goes straight to LADWP. There's way more opportunity in Indian country. So I think, there was just an announcement last week that the Hopi tribe now have a power purchase agreement with the city of Flagstaff in northern Arizona to meet their 100% requirement. So this is an opportunity for tribes to pair up with the cities, pair up with the corporations, and of course pair up with the utilities if they're interested. I like to talk to cities and and the corporations, because that's where the action is. It's not going to be in trying to sell APS power. APS doesn't care. But if I can sell to Walmart in APS's territory, then APS is going to care. And that's basically what's been happening in Arizona, for example. So I think those are the things tribes can do to adapt, to support other people's mitigation efforts, make some money, get some jobs, provide some resiliency to the community, and exercise their sovereign authorities to protect their community in those ways.
Helpful. Angie, are there similar drivers? We've talked a little bit about franchise negotiations. We're obviously talking a lot about the power sector or beyond. Are there other leverage points that you see cities starting to think about in terms of magnifying their impact, even potentially beyond just the city boundaries?
Sure. I think one of the innovations we're seeing right now is this divestment movement. So the city of New York announcing that they will divest from fossil fuels through their pension plan. That'll be billions of dollars of investment that will go somewhere else. We hope that it will go to something that will be positive for the community. I imagine that it will be. The other thing I think is interesting and something to watch is the announcement from Moody's recently that they're going to start looking at cities and states in terms of their credit rating as to how well prepared they are for the impacts of climate change. And how much action they are taking. So I think from a competitive standpoint, where you have industries that are worried about competing against each other, we're going to have cities and states that are going to be competing against each other based on how well prepared they are to move forward.
Can I add to that? There are a lot of cities with their own municipal utility. So a good example is Fort Collins has its own municipal utility, and they have a climate plan. They have a renewable energy target. So a zero emissions target, and as a result of that, they own Platte River Power Authority along with 3 other municipalities. So Fort Collins, Estes Park, Longmont, and Loveland co-own Platte River Power Authority, but because Fort Collins is sort of the first mover, Platte River Power Authority is closing Rawhide early. And that's the direct impact of a city's action. So you take a state like Texas where there's 15 gigawatts of wind, and but you are in the state legislature. There's not a lot of friendly people when you start talking about clean energy policy. But you've got the cities of San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas that are all fairly much on board a clean energy agenda. Houston is coming, but Austin and San Antonio are way ahead, and partly because they have their own municipal utilities. I say that in Boulder, understanding what a tense issue this is, that I probably shouldn't have brought it up. But it is this thing that is also making a difference, in addition to where you have franchise agreements, that you have these independent cities, and being a big mover can actually cause the utility or the power purchaser, the power producer, to act in a way that advances their plans to shut down coal or to less fossil
Can I
fuel.
talk about water utilities for a second?
Sure.
Because that's totally random. But so one conversation that really got started when people were planning for clean power plan compliance was some of the hugest users of electricity in a city is the water utility, because it takes a lot of electricity to move water around, like a lot. And so, we were working with a lot of groups to try and come up with compliance tools that could be created by making water practices more efficient and therefore reducing use of electricity. And so that kind of died down when there stopped being a CPP to implement. But there's this whole conversation about smart communities now. And one of the things, there's a lot of things that different communities could do to make themselves smart. You can define that in a lot of ways. A lot of that has a climate element. And unfortunately, one of the things that communities and cities often lack are resources. And there are great public-private partnerships where you can work with the water utility, the electric utility, look at how you make the water system more efficient. It ends up being, better for the city. Sometimes you can, DC, where I live, actually just issued green bonds to upgrade their entire water system. It was the largest green bond ever issued. Better service, cleaner water, more efficient, reduced emissions. There's a lot of cool stuff that cities can do, and sometimes what they need to do is find a partner who's willing to make investments with them. And sometimes that can be either the water utility or the utility that serves them. There's been a lot of DOE programs, like Smart City Challenge grants. I'm trying to remember that Columbus, Ohio got one, and people don't always associate Ohio with being the most proactive city or state on environmental issues. They're doing a range of really cool things to try and drive EV deployment, to deal with their water system, to make the city safer by putting in better street lighting. There's a lot of really interesting stuff that cities could do. Unfortunately, the big hang-up tends to be investment and access to capital.
Great. So I could keep asking questions to this panel all evening, but that might stand in the way of the reception. Hoping to maybe draw in some audience questions for a little bit before we go back to some of my hard-hitting questions for the panelists. So I don't know if anyone has any questions they want to toss into the mix. Sean's going to be coming around with the microphone. Maybe you, sir, can go ahead. Yeah.
Back to Denver. So I was talking to him 3 or 4 years ago. The global initiative got very.
Yeah, I recently heard a really interesting talk by the climate change lobby people on carbon tax, revenue neutral, give the money back to the public, involving bipartisan Congress people trying to build, a nonpartisan approach. The carbon tax seems very simple to implement compared to cap and trade. I sort of sense from these conversations that the other side of the coin may be that cap and trade is implemented through political organizations rather than the individuals that would pay the carbon tax. Could anyone comment on the pros and cons of cap and trade versus carbon tax?
I'll go for it.
I was like, I know you have an opinion on this.
I totally have an opinion on it. So I think at a very simple level, the carbon tax approach provides you with certainty around the costs associated with each ton of CO2 emitted, where the cap and trade approach provides you with certainty around the emission reduction outcomes. So if you want certainty around your emission levels, you are in many respects better off, I would argue, going with a cap approach. If you want certainty over your price, you are often better off going with a tax approach. Obviously, both programs can be developed in ways that try to create a little bit more certainty around price on the cap and trade strategy. So the RGGI program in the Northeast, for example, their recent program review, they have a cost containment reserve and a price floor. So they try to keep the costs associated with each ton within a narrow band. And then on the carbon tax side, there have been emerging discussions talking about environmental integrity mechanisms, and is there sort of an automatic adjustment trigger if you're not achieving the emissions levels that are required? But those are, at least from my perspective, the two main differences between the approaches.
Cap and trade, how to distribute the cap?
Yeah.
Who gets how many allowances in the beginning? Yeah, that's a fun political fight.
Price on what relates to price of
Yeah.
So the Clean Power Plan was going to make it possible for states to enter a trading program. Still unclear exactly how, because there are two different ways to count your either mass or rate, and so that was kind of confusing. But if it hadn't been stayed right now, the Western United States would be writing a cap and trade program because the states knew their caps. They knew their targets that they had to get to, and North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana were not going to get there without really serious economic consequences to communities in their state. The allowances were all on the West Coast in Oregon, Washington, and California, and they had allowances to sell into a market where these other people would have bought, and the cap was we're going to get to a 30% reduction by 2030 or a 32% reduction of emissions from 2005 emissions by 2030. So the EPA said that's our cap, and we're going to set up a trading regime if you want that you can enter, and the Clean Power Plan was that. You base it around how you want to cap your emissions, and then let a market work on that depending upon how far people are ahead in allowances or behind in their target.
EPA gave each state they looked at the resources in each state and made an assessment of what kind of reductions they thought were possible based on that resource mix, and that's how each state got a cap, so they could stick them all together and make a big trading regime. And then the individual states were going to have to go to EPA with plans for distributing the allowances that were equal to the cap, and they didn't have to give them to the generating folks.
Right.
So.
Go ahead.
Yeah, taking a different version of cap and trade, fee and dividend, and going to the title of this panel, which is bottom up.
Uh-oh, what was the title?
You got to take that. You don't just start the city and the tribe and the state. The bottom is the people. That's the culture. The culture, cap and trade is playing around above. It was that. You got to get fee and dividend where it comes down to individuals making their personal allocation of funds and getting it funded. They pay on the fee, but they get the dividend. You got to get down to the people, the culture, economically, and that's what CCL does. So that's the bottom line from the bottom up, and that's the related cap and trade, but it doesn't get to the people.
Yeah. There is actually an example in Colorado. Now, I'm not sure that they would call it a carbon tax, but the Renewable Energy Mitigation Program, the REMP program in Pitkin County, right, says each homeowner has an energy budget. This is new construction, right? You have an energy budget. If you exceed that energy budget, you either have to install renewables on site or you pay a fee, right? You pay a tax. That money then goes into a fund that funds energy efficiency or renewable energy at schools and nonprofits and in the community. So there is kind of a mechanism like that in place in Colorado that you could look at.
People's habits and people's economic decisions.
Yeah, well, I can't say that, I can't speak for homeowners and home builders in Aspen as to whether or not they've made, taken out a heated sidewalk because of the REMP program. But they may have. But it is a pricing signal that says, don't do that or you pay.
Any other questions out there?
Do any of you, maybe this is off subject, but do any of you have any ideas about blockchain for transactive energy?
Oh, I have lots of ideas about that.
I'll look to you.
So blockchain is a ledger, right? It just tracks the movement of, doesn't actually change the movement. That's what I want to say is it doesn't actually change the movement of power. Power still moves across the power lines. So when someone was talking about, I think they're having a microgrid in Brooklyn and their transactive energy in Brooklyn, what people are doing in Brooklyn is neighbors are transacting renewable energy credits with each other. They're not actually taking the renewable power from one person's house and giving it to another person's house because it still just goes onto the existing distribution system, and electrons are weird, they go wherever they want. So it's a little bit of it. I don't like the way that it's talked about. It could be really great for making like efficiencies in electricity markets, but I don't know that the promise of allowing people to trade energy with each other is as real as people sell it as, because you still need the infrastructure.
And how does it work with if the utility, if it's run through, I'm presuming in Brooklyn, is it run through?
Yeah, Con Ed still owns all those lines, right? So it's just like if we were neighbors and she had solar and I didn't, I could buy her excess renewable capacity, but basically I'm just paying her for it. I'm not actually getting any of her electricity. That's all it is a financial transaction.
Between the people
Yeah.
outside of the.
Yeah, they're having a financial transaction separate and apart from whatever it is they're paying Con Ed for their bill. And the person who has the solar on their roof probably is seeing a bill reduction because they're generating some of their power, and they do have net metering in New York State. So when you do that, you don't pay for any of the electricity that you generate on site, and then they have to pay you for any of it you put on the system. It's basically you saying that you like renewables a lot and you want to support your neighbor's installation of renewables. But
Awesome. So I'm going to take it back up a level out of the
blockchain
news
is pretty detailed.
into
Yeah.
sort of big picture and talk a bit about ambition. And I'm going to use the DTE Jerry Anderson example. It's possible that the first time Jerry Anderson said his company was going to reduce carbon emissions by 80% below 2005 levels by 2050 was at that exciting EEI meeting right before the election where companies were committing to climate leadership. And he reiterated that commitment recently at a climate leadership conference in Denver. And
They had a press release.
and it was in a press release and many other, it's appeared in regulatory filings, it's out there. But what's interesting is that when he talks about that commitment, he talks about how it came about while his company was evaluating their ability to comply with the Clean Power Plan. And I think for those of us in the room who've spent a lot of time on the Clean Power Plan, there's a bit of a difference between the level of ambition in the Clean Power Plan and reducing CO2 emissions by 80% on potentially a trajectory towards near zero by mid-century. And I think something that's happened that's been quite interesting in the last year has been really a stepwise shift in the scale of ambition that people are talking about in terms of power sector reductions. So I'd like to ask the panelists why they think that is. Is it because of the incredible cost declines we've seen in renewables over the last year and a half, PTC and ITC extension, understanding the scope and scale of the climate challenge and looking at what we committed to in Paris? Why do you guys think that we're now talking about almost close to near decarbonization by mid-century in the
Well, probably two big reasons. One, prices are plummeting on renewables. So, and the sky is falling scenario from even 3 or 4 years ago about the intermittency problem, and you're going to blow up the grid, and and obviously California and CalISO has proven that we can manage substantial amounts of intermittent renewables in a very big system and not do that. So kind of that sky is falling scenario has not occurred. So people are deploying more and more renewables because of that, right? I mean, I think that was psychologically one of the biggest obstacles, because despite renewable portfolio requirements, which required people to do it, there was still, it's always a ceiling, right? It's never a floor. It's always a ceiling. And now people are not even worried. Now California's looking at 100% renewable requirement because they're confident they can deal with intermittent systems. So I think the price combined with solving that problem has further declined the price. I think the other piece is, quite frankly, the corporate consumer push for it. You see virtually no movement in any other states around upping their RPS requirements. Nevada hasn't really done it. Arizona hasn't done it, although maybe they might. New Mexico hasn't done it. So, and yes, there's some states that have, kind of promoted it, but even Ohio didn't they reduce it? Michigan reduced it. So
no, Michigan increased it. Ohio had a moratorium, and the governor vetoed an extension of the moratorium. But Michigan increased their RPS 2 years ago.
Did they 2 years? Okay, yeah. So 4 years ago they had reduced it, and then they've increased. So states are kind of all over the place. So I think it is literally the corporate procurement is driving that now. And that's a consumer-driven thing. I think between shareholders and millennials saying, you know what, if you're not a clean power company, I'm not shopping at you.
Or I'm not working for you.
Or I'm not working for you. So I think, you know, that future demographic wave that's coming through and the money that represents, I think, is driving a great deal of corporate America. I mean, they have the Googles and the Microsofts and all the Silicon hippies are doing their thing. I say that from the area, so I can talk about my people like that. But but I do think that there's so those are kind of critical behavioral changes that you were talking about, right? That's the consumer behavioral change. It may be that I still like to buy my Hummer because my gas is too cheap, but I'm not going to shop at Home Depot if they don't have solar panels on the rooftop, right? Everybody loves going to IKEA now because they all have solar panels on the rooftop. So I think those are the two major things that are happening.
So I think that the Navajo generating station is a great example of what's going on. And that does include natural gas as part of the equation, but the Navajo generating station was co-owned by 4 utilities and the Bureau, 5 utilities in the Bureau of Reclamation. One of the bureaus.
You, the United States taxpayer.
And so, but the 5 utilities had a majority position, and they voted to shut it down because they said it was going to cost them $100 to $125 million to run that instead of doing some combination of gas, solar, and wind, mostly gas and solar, because it's in Page, Arizona. And so there's a cost component to this, and when Xcel Energy filed their plan to shut down 2 plants in Pueblo early and to get to 55% renewable energy by 2025, that was far more than anybody would have thought possible, you know, again, 10 or 15 years ago. But they want to get to 55 or 60% renewables by 2025, 2026. They're not going to lose money doing that, right? This is not about Xcel saying, we're going to sacrifice dollars. And the other part to that, so I think everything you said was true. I do think state policy is still playing a big role in some places. And New York's going 50% renewable, may try and go to a bigger renewable. Hawaii went to 100. Rhode Island went to 100% renewable. So there's still states out there, big and small, that are kind of trying to drive that through policy. But I think utilities are saying Donald Trump's not going to be president forever. And we've got to do resource planning now for 20 years from now. And so what they're doing, their experience right now, is they are stranding assets. The Navajo Generating Station had a life out to 2044, and they're going to strand that asset in 2019, 25 years earlier. And so I think utilities are trying to say, what's the right way to plan, especially with utility business models that we're worried about, what's the right way to plan for the next 20 or 30 years so we're not stranding some asset because there's now a price on carbon, there's some kind of a cap and dividend or a cap and trade program, and we can no longer run combined cycle natural gas because solar and storage is out there and it's cheaper.
So Emily, how helpful would it be?
To bring all of us back to EPI. No.
How helpful would this be for the power sector to actually know what was required of them by mid-century? How different would your hands be?
Sounds like your mic.
Oh dear.
A little closer. The power sector, the utility.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how, I don't know why this is off. My question is,
How different would it be if you said you all have to do X by 2050? How would that change what's currently happening?
you knew what your ambition had to be by mid-century from your sector.
I have a hard time answering that, if only because the one thing that we've learned over the last decade is the pace of technological change is such that I don't know that. I guess I'll go back and answer the first question, which is, why are these things happening? I don't disagree with anything that anyone said. I think all those things are true about costs and customers, but what really happened is we saw that we could do it, right? The technology came on board. We figured out how to do a better job integrating renewables into the system. I'm not 100% sure that the CAISO thinks they can do 100, but they're going to keep trying, right?
They're not going to have.
They're going to keep trying. They're going to keep trying. They'll figure it out, but if they had to do it today, I think they'd be a little panicky. But we basically saw that we could do it, right? We closed a ton of coal in 2015. We closed about a third of the coal fleet in 2015 because of Martz. I think Professor Spence mentioned that. And before that period, there was a lot of conversation about, like, what would that do to the system? Like, what would it do to customers? What would it do to our employees? We laid off a lot of people. That's not a fun thing to do. What would it do to the local economies? And we wrote it out, right? Things were okay. A large measure because gas was cheap, renewables keep getting cheaper, we were able to deal with it. And I think once companies, which are conservative with a little c, see that they can do it, then they go, okay, what else can I do? And it really is about the marriage of technology and policy and price. And sometimes I just wonder, like, if we were to try and set a policy now that says, we all have to do X by 2050, would it be the ceiling and not the floor? I think they like long-term certainty, but I think what they know right now is just that they need to keep reducing, and that's the trajectory that they're on. I don't actually know right now that some sort of hard and fast, like 2050 target would actually make it go any faster. I think making sure that we bring down the cost of storage, investing in making sure that, the panel costs come down, making wind more efficient, figuring out how to use gas really efficiently only when we really need it and making that affordable. I think that's maybe more important is the R&D and the tech side.
That's helpful. So we've obviously talked a lot about the power sector, but the ambition that we need is economy-wide. And we heard earlier today about some of the steps that are likely to be taken in a backwards direction in the transportation sector. It's, I think, it overtook the power sector last year as the single.
Well, they overtook us. I want credit for that.
Overtook you. It's the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the country. And a lot of the commitments that we've seen, whether they're from state actors, corporate actors, or municipal governments, have actually encompassed economy-wide commitments. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a challenging question, maybe the last question for the panelists. We'll see how close we are on time. But if each of you had one piece of advice for a mayor, a governor, a tribal leader, power sector executive, to translate the ambitious commitments they are making into concrete actions over the next 3-year time horizon that will get them close to meeting the ambitious level of the commitments that they've made. America's Pledge, right? 16 states, or not America's Pledge, Climate Alliance, 16 states have joined the Climate Alliance, committing to economy-wide reductions, 26%, 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. Only a handful of states are even close to meeting that. One or two pieces of advice that you would give to actually get us closer to meeting those goals over the next couple of years?
Well, I'll start. So I kind of view the transportation problem as analogous versus the power sector problem with emissions, analogous to kind of point source pollution in the water side and non-point source pollution, right? So you can control point source pollution pretty easily because it's a discrete conveyance, right, going into the water system. It's the non-point source that you just don't know what to do with. So the better ways that you see some of the best practices in the non-point source pollution efforts is on a regional level, right? It's in a watershed level. So I think if you look at kind of these other things that are contributing, the million cars, right? It's kind of like non-point source pollution that from a tribal perspective and the impacts that kind of this broader stuff could have on the tribal community and what the tribe can do, tribe can only do so much on its lands, right? So it can control certainly the kind of cars they buy, the kind of trucks they buy. It may be able to control from tribal housing, energy efficiency efforts, certainly in the government building, certainly in the casino. If they have a casino, it's the largest load. So it can control its own behavior in that way. It can work to try and mitigate the kind of power that it's buying, either by negotiating with their utility or going somewhere else to get greener power. But it's also still part of this broader ecosystem of pollution. And so what else can a tribe do if it's concerned about the impact on its community in working with the other stakeholders in that ecosystem? So there are models where tribes have done this on non-point source pollution in their watersheds, and especially tribes that have treaty fishing rights, right? So they care about the pollution in the water to protect their fish. Well, I should be a little bit worried about my people too. So maybe that kind of a model, working with, again, the local stakeholders around region-wide solutions, almost these energy ecosystem solutions that recognizes everybody's in the same boat around that. And so whether it's For example, the Volkswagen Mitigation Trust account creates an opportunity for tribes to work with their local communities, and a lot of tribes right now are talking to their school districts who either have schools on the reservation or bring buses into the reservation to take the kids off reservation. So the tribes will take their money, they'll partner up with the school district to replace the school buses with electric buses. So those kinds of things now become opportunities to work within this non-point source pollution problem that we have in everything else.
So I would say it's hard to say one thing, but if I can say maybe three things and make it quick. So I do think in the electricity sector, we've moved a long way down the road. I don't know that you can say we have it solved, but if you're going to focus on the electricity sector, governors particularly should focus on utility commissions, because utility CEOs are telling us their technology is 10 years ahead of where the utility industry is, but the utilities and the CEOs say they're 10 years ahead of where commissions are.
Yep.
And having good commissioners, there's almost no substitute for it for doing well by your electricity sector. Second thing is, as this has happened, I think political leadership needs to shift their focus to the built environment and to the transportation sector. The built environment is a huge part of the problem still, and while we have focused on the electricity sector, we've allowed home builders in this country to continue to do a variety of things that have not helped in terms of energy conservation, and there's so much still there to do. And then the final thing on the transportation sector, I do think that there's some important things that we can do. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but you're right about the emissions, and there's just, I think, wonderful opportunities for states to be involved in helping build out a transportation sector like the energy sectors that we built out over the last 20 years.
Great. I think cities need to join a network, preferably ICLEI, because you do. You need your peers. You need support. You need to have that cover. You don't want to be the first mayor out unless you're a big city mega city mayor, right? You want to have some cover in terms of what other mayors are doing. So have a plan. I would love it if cities would not make one more commitment until they have a plan to follow through on the commitments that they've already made, because so many of them don't. Look to your neighbors. A lot of these challenges are regional. Transportation for sure is a regional challenge for all of us, and so we need to really work with our neighbors, our COGs, and at the state level. Cities need to be stronger advocates at the state level. They really need to get out there and say we want better renewable policies, we want low carbon, et cetera. And look to the Global South. I think that we see in the Global South that because of a lack of resources, there is the solutions there are applied to multiple problems. Mm-hmm. Whereas here in the United States, we tend to think of things in engineering terms and specific technology terms, and so that sort of puts us into silos. We need to have a more holistic view of our problems. Yeah.
So I'm going to switch up the question for Emily just to throw
you such a good answer,
ball.
Go ahead.
You can still give it. I guess I think about the power sector as having two challenges at this moment in time. The first challenge is fulfilling the promise that appears to be in the sector to continue to achieve significant levels of emission reductions. And you can imagine a range of future scenarios where those emissions can actually start to creep back up again after 2025. So I think a big challenge for the sector is to make sure that the declining trends that we're seeing in emissions continue. But I think the second challenge, and this is the one I hope you can talk a little bit about in your final comment, Emily, is how does the power sector start to prepare to be a solution for the other sectors? And you touched on this a little bit in your opening comments, but there's a tremendous opportunity for electrification across not just the transportation sector, but other sectors. And there's an opportunity for low-cost decarbonization. So how is your industry thinking about that, and what kind of advice would you give, if you could, to the CEOs on how to think about it and the types of things they should be evaluating?
Later, you'll have to tell me why you think emissions are going up after 2025. I'm not worried about that. I'm really not.
They could.
I'm really not, though. I'm not worried about that. So here's what we figured out about electric vehicles. We're in the classic chicken and egg problem, or like what comes first, the cars or the infrastructure. And at least anecdotal evidence demonstrates, just use another cliche, that if you build it, they will come. So my favorite story right now is that KCP&L is Kansas City Power and Light. It's in Kansas City, Missouri. Decided that they wanted to build 1,000 charging stations in Kansas City. People don't associate them with being very climate friendly either. And they were like, nope, we want to be a leader in electric vehicles and electrification of the transportation sector. So, and they knew that their commission would never allow them to rate base it. They just knew because it doesn't benefit all customers, right? That's one of the requirements is benefiting all customers. And there's a lot of talk about how if you do stuff for electric vehicles right now, you're only helping rich Tesla owners, right? So they're like, we're just going to use shareholder dollars and we're going to put in a network of 1,000 charging stations. They call it Clean Charge. They promoted the heck out of it. They saw a 26% increase in EV sales in Kansas City last year. So we think that that's our role in the transportation sector is people have emotional feelings about how they charge their vehicles. Apparently gas stations bring people a lot of comfort. And they need to know that if they need gas, they know where to get it. And the paradigm is going to be different with charging your vehicle. I think in a lot of places you're going to charge at home, you're going to charge at work. I don't know that we need like a ton of public charging. It certainly depends on where you live. But we think that's our contribution is that we need to step up, and we are trying to do that right now on the infrastructure side. If that's what makes 26% more people buy EVs in Kansas City in 2017, then that's what we got to do. So.
That's a great note to end on. I feel like we're a little bit over time. Sorry, Alice, but we'll thank the panelists for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I wanted to, and I don't know if you guys want to sit here. I don't know, Bill, if you have to go or not, but so maybe just hang.
I'm a former governor. I get to stay for
Oh, yeah.
the reception.
Oh, good, good, good. So I used to staff him, so I'll quickly bring you a beer. And I called him Bill. It took me a really long time to do that. We would just say him. So I really wanted to incorporate, I mean, Boulder audiences, there's always just so many brilliant minds. We have a little bit of time. Our other speakers, I'd really like you to feel, if you want to come down or just answer questions. But we really covered a lot today, obviously starting what's happening with this current administration on the federal level. I loved hearing from Kerry Clow kind of the history of what's happening at EPA. His view is a 30-plus year, an intern when EPA started. I didn't know that about him. It was pretty fascinating about the different transitions. Hearing from representatives from the mining industry, the oil and gas industry about wanting more cooperation between environmental communities and their organizations, and that good data equals good rules, and that idea of cooperative federalism. And Heidi from Justice brought in what's going on at the Interior. We've obviously talked a lot about EPA, but some of the actions going on at Interior about public lands. And then we heard from the environmental organizations who are involved with litigation, including a representative from state of New Mexico, whose attorney general has been earning some PR around his actions on environmental protections. And these groups are tracking what's going on. They're obviously involved with the There's various theories we've heard about. And we heard about, which I'd like to talk a little bit more in this next 20 minutes or so, about failure to perform. What are those lawsuits going to look like? We kind of just mentioned that just a little bit. There's also something called public trust litigation, this youth litigation that just had a successful Ninth Circuit decision. It's where a group of youth, some from Boulder around the country, are suing for the right to a clean environment. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm about how far that would go, but the Ninth Circuit just basically ruled against the Trump administration, so the trial right now at least is proceeding. David, I can't even begin to summarize all of what David Spence went through, but really talking about the different models where our clean energy portfolios are going, the change in energy resources, the cost reductions, et cetera. And of course now just hearing about all the things that are going on with local, state, tribal governments. And what utilities are doing, and what they need and how they change. I loved really hearing about that customer demand, the investor demand, which we don't always think about. And I didn't know that a quarter of the shareholders are from Europe and are demanding that change. I had no idea about that. I guess one thing I'd love to we touched a little bit about electrifying everything and that push toward EVs. I was glad we hit on that too. And I'll start it off with one question, and then I really want to hand it off to the audience. And back to Pilar, and I think you kind of hit on this, but I'd love to know, I mean, it seems to me there's so much potential, and you've mentioned about producing energy or demanding energy. The other thing in the past I've thought about for tribes as sovereigns, and I don't know how much oil and gas drilling is taking place on tribal lands, but it seems like tribes could be in a position to really demand some advanced technology around zero emissions, and say, if you want to drill here, that's great, but these are the things you have to do. Do you see any of that happening, or do you think there's potential for that driving some really significant
Is this on?
technology changes?
No. No, some tribes actually do. So there's maybe 10, maybe 15 at the most tribes that have oil and gas reserves. And that includes Fort Berthold, which is just all shale or whatever they're doing up there. So there's been a fight between the tribes and the federal government over like the hydraulic fracturing rule, the methane waste rule, and one of the previous panels talked about the BLM's methane waste rule, right? So half of that fight was tribes fighting the BLM to say you can't regulate our oil and gas operations, which was a losing fight to a certain extent. But tribes the oil and gas tribes are definitely trying to take more control of their oil and gas operations. Tribes like Southern Ute, down here, Southern Colorado, a little bit more advanced, technologically advanced. So they're probably one of the few tribes that are, in fact, trying to worry about kind of minimizing waste and doing stuff a little bit, taking advantage of advanced technology. In fact, a little known story when I think I can say this. Is anybody here from DOE? I think I can say this. When the Department of Energy declassified horizontal drilling, Southern Ute was one of the first places to do it. Mm-hmm. So horizontal drilling was first used on the Southern Ute Reservation to get to shale systems. So they weren't the first to use hydraulic fracturing, but so they're known for taking advantage of technological advances. I don't think that's generally true anywhere else on tribal lands, and that's primarily because, with the exception of the Utah Utes, everybody else is just leasing land and leasing their oil and gas reserves. So they're just trying to extract as much oil, get as much royalty, paying little to no attention to regulation. Most tribes don't have their own regulatory scheme, so the BLM regulatory scheme is what's controlling. So unfortunately, for most oil and gas producing tribes, the answer is no. But for somebody like a Southern Ute, who's probably the most prolific oil producing tribe outside of Fort Berthold, the answer is yes.
Can I say something about oil and gas? So, the lesson that we've taken is that when big customers ask us to do things, we'd better do it. It occurred to us relatively recently that we're the largest purchasers of gas. It's also used for home heating, but because we're using so much more of it for electricity generation nationwide, electric companies are the largest purchasers of natural gas. And so we have started conversations with the upstream gas producers. What can you do to make your gas cleaner, i.e. deal with all of the leaks and the flaring and the methane? Because that's what we'd like to see as the buyer of your gas. Side note, because our customers want us to say that if we're using gas, we're using the cleanest gas we can be using. So I think we're trying to apply some lessons that we learned and see if we can bring the oil and gas guys to at least a lot of the stuff that they need to do. I think someone pointed out isn't super expensive. They just don't have a reason to do it right now.
So there was actually a project done by MJ Bradley out of the Northeast. 9 utilities, including XL Energy, actually did just this, and they said, these are the 4 things that we care about for the upstream producers. And we're going to look at it where we buy our gas, depending upon these practices. And it's methane capture, it's chemical use and chemical disclosure, it is water and water safety, and then finally, community safety and community health and safety. And so those 9 producers are saying, we'll look And we will, if you as an upstream producer are not doing the right things in these 4 categories, we're not going to buy your gas. We're not going to engage in a long-term contract with you.
I know that's a huge issue of interest in Boulder County, and we hadn't really addressed it too much today, so thanks. So are there any students in the audience that have a question? They'll show up for the reception, but. And Sean has a microphone. Any other questions? I know we haven't gotten back over in this corner. Sure. Oh, yeah. No.
Good idea. Last week I was in Moscow as part of their advisory panel on that city's new sweeping sustainability initiative. It's pretty exciting. I spoke with you just last week, Angie. Thank you. I gave the city of Moscow your insights. Given your individual areas of expertise and the other speakers earlier, what advice would you have for the world's 11th largest city that's one panelist called the Grand Moscow Experiment in Sustainability?
Oh, I thought you were talking about Moscow, Idaho.
I'd really be curious to hear how far along they are in their journey. I mean, it's a pretty like plan, do, check, act sort of thing, right? Like they've got to understand if they're targeting emission reductions, where are their emissions coming from, what are the opportunities to reduce those, put that plan in place, see how it's working, and then adjust. I don't know what their governance structure looks like, but also I think that what we would like to see is more cities investing in urban sustainability themselves. We see that a lot of cities are sort of waiting for the next round of grants from the Department of Energy, or when will Bloomberg have a big offering and we can get some millions of dollars to do some sustainability work in our city. We wouldn't be waiting for Bloomberg to fund, police, fire safety. So I think if we're really serious about doing this at the urban level, then we need to start seeing cities invest in it themselves.
David, did you have a comment?
I was just going to say,
There's a mic.
oh, thank you. I don't know the answer to your question, but I know that there are a lot of other big cities that have gotten further along this process, and I know that Los Angeles in particular has embarked on a sort of a grand sustainability experiment where they've gotten pretty aggressive about soliciting ideas from a variety of different sources, and then going through a systematic process to try and choose the ones that they think are implementable and doable. And I think they're at least several years into that. And I don't know, it's probably a politically inopportune time for Moscow to reach out to an American city, but it seems to me they could learn from and LA is not as big as Moscow, but they could learn from other cities that have gotten further along this process.
My question goes to federal funding. As you can appreciate, if an administration supports your policies, they're more likely to provide dollars to you. With this administration, which seems to have a very different view of a lot of the issues we talked about, how do you think that lack of federal funding, or will it be lack of federal funding, how will that affect what you're doing, particularly the NGOs?
So the Energy Foundation that I run is maybe the biggest NGO that does funding on energy policy. TNC is probably the biggest NGO, or just budget-wise, they're a $707 million a year organization. We're about $120 million now. And so the way we look at it is we've been able to, we think, raise money to supplement efforts because of what's happening at the federal level. But I think, one of the things that we do, we pay attention to the administration's budget, but pay attention to what happens when it gets to the Senate. And so NREL is a great example. It's got 1,900 employees, and there's a big conversation about cutting a big part of its budget. I think a third of its budget, maybe more, was what's in the president's budget. And I suspect that because of Cory Gardner and the politicization of this issue, that he will do what he can to protect NREL's budget and maybe protect the whole thing. I don't know if that's true everywhere, but Lamar Alexander is not going to let the Oak Ridge Labs budget get cut in a very big way. And I suspect there are Congress people, Republicans in California, that are going to feel that way too about Lawrence Berkeley Livermore, or Lawrence Livermore Labs, or whatever it is.
The Livermore Labs.
But that's kind of true of all these national labs. It may be the places that are most vulnerable are not the lab system, but places like what we have in Boulder, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is run by the University Center for Atmospheric Research that gets this National Science Foundation grant. And that's helpful and hopeful, but there are other things like NOAA that are probably more vulnerable and maybe less likely to be as easy to politicize as something like NREL. So I'm pretty comfortable that NREL's budget's probably going to be, I think, saved by Cory Gardner. But I also feel like there are other places in Colorado where it's going to be vulnerable. When I was governor, the Nobel Prize went to the IPCC. We had 43 scientists from Colorado who participated in that Nobel Prize from a variety of federal agencies. And there are some of those federal agencies that are probably vulnerable.
There's a question.
I want to mention that NCAR has already taken a substantial hit on social sciences, including risk communication and risk perception studies, which are really important in getting people informed and working against the disinformation campaigns and the endless jive from Burton Marsteller about how it's only a theory. That delayed tobacco regulation 20 years, and it's now hurting the world. My question is based on wanting to thank Ms. Saransky for bringing up the critically important discount rate. And I want to mention the new National Institute of Building Sciences study. It's called Mitigation Saves. It's a huge update to the 2005 study on the benefit cost analysis of natural hazard mitigation. Are people using the overlap of natural hazard mitigation with climate adaptation and also climate mitigation, two very different senses of mitigation, unfortunately due to international language translations. But there's an enormous intersection in things like green infrastructure and better water management. Is that penetrating the rest of the country? It's here and there, places like Boulder, a few other places. Real progress in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. Lots of case studies emerging, but it seems relatively underappreciated. Can that be more effective? Thank you all for the whole day.
What's the name? Mitigation what?
Mitigation saves.
Yes, cities are definitely looking at both climate mitigation, mitigating their emissions, and also preparing for the impacts of climate change. So they're identifying their hazards, they're looking at their critical infrastructure within their cities, they're developing plans to address that. And we are seeing more nature-based solutions. The Washington, D.C., as an example, has an interesting stormwater credit trading mechanism to manage stormwater and finance the management of that stormwater.
Because our pipes date to the Civil War. I'm not making that up. Yeah.
It was the War of 1812.
Yeah.
On the tribal side, I think probably the same challenge, well, definitely the same challenge that maybe smaller cities have, getting also to the funding question, right? So the federal government just has never had enough money for tribes, both to do climate adaptation planning and then to help them implement whatever it is they've planned for. So, but what we do see in tribal plans is, especially in the natural environment, is the application of traditional ecological knowledge. And so you'll see tribes employ their understanding of their environment as their adaptation plan. So it's not going to be necessarily a kind of a Western science plan all the time. And so sometimes that will help tribes kind of keep moving along. But in the end, you got to have money to rebuild the infrastructure. And that's really where I think the biggest challenge for a lot of smaller entities is going to be. Personally, I'm a big fan of public-private partnerships. There's a lot of money sloshing around, especially after our 50% tax cut in corporate America. A lot of money slushing around that could be put to good use in these regards. I don't know if I want to give them ownership of it, but I do think that there's opportunities really for especially these smaller cash-strapped. The grants just don't go far enough. You got to leverage up somehow. So this is why getting partnerships with corporations and banks and all these folks who are starting to move in a more favorable direction. Part of that effort has also got to be funding the green infrastructure that you may need, using traditional ecological knowledge, not just for the tribe, but for the surrounding community, to help deal with adaptation. I mean, they just had this massive fire up by Colville, the Colville Reservation in Washington, and the Colville tribe was showing them how to use their old firefighting techniques to help kill that part of the wildfire up there. So people are starting to see that TEK is actually useful from a Western perspective, and that's also part of the adaptation planning that a lot of tribes are doing, and they incorporate.
What is TEK?
Traditional ecological knowledge.
I'll say that adaptation is also something that investors focus on. And that's actually one way that they engage with the oil and gas community, which is tell us how your facilities will withstand, potential changes to the natural environment as a result of climate change. If you've got rigs in the ocean, what does it mean if the ocean rises? What does that, So that's an interesting way that the investor community also plays in adaptation, not just, mitigation of emissions.
So I have, and I think it's a great time to wrap up, but I have a couple of logistical things really, really quickly. So right through those doors, we'll have a reception, hopefully carry on some of these great conversations. At 6 o'clock, we're having a debate, which is free and open to the public, so more folks are going to be coming in, so you might want to just grab your stuff when you go in there for those of you who are going to stay. I wanted to say that Emily and Paul Billings are going to be doing this debate. I hope you can stay at Pruitt's EPA, lean or malnourished. Up front, I want to thank Emily for taking one for the team on this one, so in Boulder, Colorado. So, and it's an Oxford-style debate where the audience votes before and after, so I really hope you can stay. So let's thank all of our speakers one more time, and we can go have a beer. Hi.
Alice. Sorry. I'm going to go grab the alcohol, but then I'll be back down to figure out how you want to set this up.